because for the first 6 months that I talked about this, from October 2016 and through the spring of 2017, the literal example that I would use is like, look, it's not like there's going to be an email from the Russians saying, we're the Russians and we'd like to help, that they send to Donald Trump. And then it turns out actually that email literally exists.
Delighted to welcome back to the Shorenstein Center and to the Kennedy School campus, Garrett M. Graff. Today he serves as the executive director of the Aspen Institute's Cybersecurity and Technology program. But he is here in part because of his work as the author of several books. Most significantly, The Threat Matrix, The FBI at War, which traces the modern history of the FBI and is in many ways a biography of sorts of Bob Mueller's leadership of the FBI. His ebook, Angel is Airborne, JFK's Final Flight from Dallas, tells the dramatic story of the Air Force One flight from Dallas, Texas, back to Washington, D.C., following the assassination of President Kennedy. His most recent book, Raven Rock, explores the history of the government's Cold War doomsday plans. And he's currently just finished a book that will be out in September called The Only Plane in the Sky, an oral history of September 11th, based on a magazine piece he wrote for Politico where he interviewed all of the people who were on the plane, the president's plane, on September 11th. But what we're really here to talk about is the Mueller report and the Barr letter. Garrett joined us about, 2 years ago to talk a little bit about, a year ago. Yeah. A year ago to talk about his experience with Bob Mueller, writing a book about Mueller's leadership of the FBI. He's subsequently written a number of articles for different publications, including the first real investigative piece about Mueller's Vietnam leadership and experience as deployed in combat in Vietnam, but also covering everything about this story, about the Mueller investigation, about the role the Russians played in our elections, and it was serendipitous that we invited him months ago to speak to us today, and this will be the first time he's spoken publicly since the Mueller report was delivered to the White House. And so I have many questions to ask him, the first of which is, you must be surprised.
Yes and no. So I think that a couple of things stand out to me that are surprising, and a couple of things stand out to me that are not surprising in looking at how this is wrapped up. I was genuinely surprised that there were no additional indictments that came out of this investigation. And I say that both because there have been a lot of breadcrumbs that it appears that Mueller had been sort of pointing towards others that he might be seeking to indict. And then there are some very obvious questions like Jerome Corsi, who Bob Mueller was in advanced plea agreement talks with and had even written up a plea agreement with. And that blew up in November, December last year, and Jerome Corsi appears to have escaped any charges, which is a genuinely puzzling moment. You don't see a lot of federal prosecutors sort of identify a crime, identify the evidence that that person committed the crime, get into the plea agreement doesn't happen, and then the prosecutors are like, well, we tried. The part that I'm not necessarily that surprised by is the idea that Mueller didn't find some smoking gun evidence that was so compelling that it instantly would have led to the downfall of Donald Trump and everyone around him, which I think has been sort of this idea on the most obsessive side of the Muellerologists. And I'm going to assume, since this is Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Harvard, and you're at a lunchtime talk about Bob Mueller, some of you in this room might fit into the particularly obsessive Muellerologist crowd, and I mean no personal disrespect. But it's always seemed unlikely to me that the absolute worst case scenario was actually the thing that Mueller was going to uncover. And I'm sure we'll get to this. I think that Bob Mueller has already uncovered a lot of the worst case scenario in his investigation that we have sort of brushed past in our processing of it as a citizenry and as a society. I think on the list of things that I am genuinely surprised and puzzled by is this question that Mueller did not come up with a traditional prosecutorial decision on the question of obstruction. And I think that it's incredibly important there to see Mueller's own framing of that problem before we judge how he actually approached it, because the idea based on everything that we know about Mueller, everything we know about the team of people who have been working with Mueller, the idea that they sort of got to the end of this and were like, oh man, this is just really tough, let's just not make any decisions here, is inconsistent with sort of everything that we know about Mueller. I think it seems much more likely potentially that Mueller never imagined that he was going to make a traditional prosecutorial decision on the question of obstruction, that the obstruction question was always ultimately a question for Congress, that if Mueller was operating under the Justice Department policy that the president cannot be indicted by the executive branch, by the Justice Department, which is the operative Justice Department policy, and Mueller being, if nothing else, a traditional prosecutor. I never bought into the theory that Mueller was going to disregard that policy and try to bring an indictment of the president directly. It seems entirely possible and perhaps even likely that Mueller always saw the work that he was doing on the obstruction question as a political question, not a criminal one, and one where he was using the process and the system of the criminal justice system to be an independent fact finder, where he was going to turn over that information to Congress to weigh in the context of impeachment, Congress being the body that is constitutionally delegated to deal with questions of presidential malfeasance. That the idea, and that's one of the reasons that I do find it weird that Bill Barr has weighed in this interim, because it's when you look at the precise wording, and I made Nico print out copies of the Barr letter so that we could sort of pick it apart, being particularly obsessive Muellerologists here. When you look at the exact wording that Mueller uses, the fact that he inserted this phrase in his own words about this report does not exonerate the president, that's a remarkable statement coming in a report like this, and a report written by someone like Bob Mueller. And so the fact that Mueller would write that in his report would almost make it more puzzling that his intention was for Bill Barr to make the ultimate decision on the question of obstruction.
So you're saying that you think that a lot of what is in the Mueller report is really for Congress, that was the target of his work.
Yes, and so I think that you can sort of think of Mueller was gathering evidence in three separate buckets, right? So there was a criminal investigation around the collusion or conspiracy question, which, when you look at the Barr summary of the Mueller report, and I think that's sort of an important distinction to keep drawing. We have not seen the Mueller report. We don't know what the Mueller report says. What we do know is the Barr report on the Mueller report. When you look at that question in the Barr report, it appears that Mueller has perhaps drawn a very tight definition around that question of conspiracy, where he appears to indicate that he was only examining conspiracy in regards to an agreement, tacit or explicit, with officials of the Russian government. Russian government being a key phrase in the definition, because it would, for instance, forestall the possibility that Donald Trump was in an active conspiracy with real estate developers in Moscow, or was in an active conspiracy with oligarchs in Ukraine friendly to the Kremlin.
So first, you're saying there's the criminal conspiracy question. Mueller drew a very tight box, or it appears to from the Barr letter.
Appears to have, which would have set a very high bar for that. And I want to come back to that in just a second.
But I want to say, and that would be consistent with your reporting of Mueller all along as drawing tight constraints around this.
Very tight constraints around this, which, again, it was exactly what we sort of expected Mueller to do. When he left the FBI, sort of the first public job he took on was the NFL hired him to investigate the Ray Rice domestic violence incident, if anyone sort of remembers this. This was this incident, Baltimore Ravens player who had been videotaped in an Atlantic City casino knocking his girlfriend unconscious. Mueller was hired by the NFL to investigate their reaction, the NFL's reaction to that videotape. That was the totality of the question that Mueller investigated and answered. He did not interpret that as, how does the NFL handle domestic violence? How does the NFL interface with local law enforcement when its players are criminals? Does the NFL coddle abusers? He investigated solely this question of how the NFL handled this specific videotape. It was a stunningly thorough and tenacious investigation. It was an 89-page report. 5 pages of the report dealt with how packages arrive at the NFL headquarters, where they come in, how they move through the building, where they are stored, who signs for packages, who has access to the package area. Sort of all of these questions that, I think it's entirely possible the NFL mailroom employees did not know prior to Mueller and his team of investigators turning up. Mueller tracked down every single telephone number that had dialed in or out of the NFL headquarters during the entire, I think it was 72-hour period in question. They reached all 2,800 numbers and identified whether that was someone who could be part of the handling of this videotape. But that was the totality of the investigation, was how this question gets answered. So we sort of always expected and saw evidence that Mueller was defining his mission pretty narrowly. That's why you had the Michael Cohen case referred out to the Southern District in New York. That's why you had Michael Flynn's Turkish lobbying scheme referred out to the Eastern District of Virginia, the federal prosecutors in Arlington, Virginia. And so we sort of always expected that first bucket of the criminal investigation to be tight.
Constrained.
The second was this question of obstruction, which remember grew out of the firing of Jim Comey, sort of these questions about the Michael Flynn investigation. Did the president then or at any subsequent point act to obstruct the investigation? And this was always a complicated set of facts and law. There are legitimate questions about the intersection of the president's Article II authorities with his legally established powers. He absolutely can take certain sets of legal Article II actions, but there was a question of whether they were done with corrupt intent, which would therefore make them obstruction. That's actually a really complicated set of laws and fact, which Barr literally says in the letter that Mueller wrestles with these complicated questions of law and fact. That's the second bit. The third bucket, and this is one that most people have lost sight of already, even just 10 days after the arrival of the Mueller report to DOJ, it's the counterintelligence question. This is something where, is the president or those around him compromised in some way with Russia that falls short of a criminal conspiracy? There's all sorts of behavior that would be potentially troubling from a counterintelligence or an espionage perspective, but doesn't necessarily rise to the level of a criminal conspiracy. This, by the way, is perhaps the most interesting thing that we don't know yet, which is the FBI took this third bucket and briefed it to what's called the Gang of Eight on Capitol Hill. So this is an entirely classified part of Mueller's investigation that presumably will never see the light of day, or at least not in the next 25 to 50 years. But the fact that the FBI took it to the Gang of Eight is something that we should read something into. The Gang of Eight is the chairman and ranking members of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees, and then the head of the minority and the majority in both the House and the Senate. So this is Nancy Pelosi and Kevin McCarthy in the House, and Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer in the Senate. The Gang of Eight is a designated group that is delineated to receive the nation's most sensitive intelligence sources and methods and operations. And it's by statute a group that is smaller than the whole House and Senate Intelligence Committees, which are normally the bodies that you would turn over that information to. The Gang of Eight is like the folks who you call and you say, hey, we're about to go kill bin Laden tonight. And we have operators in the air right now. This is something that is unfolding right now. We have neither the time nor the sort of operational sensitivity to inform the full House or Senate Intelligence Committee. They're not routinely the set of people that you would sort of brief on something that was done. So part of what makes this interesting that the FBI considers the counterintelligence portion of Mueller's work still so sensitive that it can only go to the Gang of Eight means that there's probably actually still a lot of troubling stuff there that is currently unfolding. So potentially, Mueller is finding the ongoing involvement of U.S. persons in this question, that there are active operations still underway that they want to preserve the specific sensitivity of. So this is an area where, we're still far from knowing what this entails, but just the sort of wiggles and tea leaves that we're seeing actually leads me to think that there's still very troubling information to come there.
So on the criminal conspiracy charges, Mueller set a very high bar and very constrained, and it seems likely that there wasn't enough evidence to meet that threshold.
Yeah, and that was sort of the thing that I wanted to double back to on the criminal question, which is notice Mueller doesn't have the same phrasing that he has in the obstruction question, or at least as it's quoted in the Barr report on the Mueller report, which is he says Mueller didn't establish that there was a provable conspiracy. The exact phrasing, actually, the investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities. So that encompasses an incredibly large amount of possibility in it. On the one hand, that encompasses the, as the president might say, total exoneration end, which is this was all an incredibly odd series of misunderstandings and coincidences where definitely nothing went wrong, nothing was done wrong, and there was no intent to do wrong.
It's on one end.
That's on one end. This also encompasses, and this is Mueller's own words here, which I think is important because we only got 65 of them out of a report that is somewhere between 300 and 400 pages. That language also encompasses finding an incredibly large amount of evidence, there being an incredible amount of smoke that could involve a preponderance of evidence that there was an active conspiracy, even potentially evidence that was clear and consistent of a provable conspiracy, which would be the civil standard for proving something like this, but that does not refer to the possibility that
doesn't meet a criminal threshold.
It does not meet the criminal threshold, which for federal prosecutors is the ability to prove under the rules of evidence beyond a reasonable doubt to a reasonable jury with 85% certainty, which is particularly if you define the open question pretty narrowly. Mueller is setting himself a pretty high bar to meet there. So this language on the far other end is Mueller could be sitting there saying, I'm 84% certain that there is an active criminal conspiracy in the midst of the 2016 election between Donald Trump and the Russian government. But I don't have that final thing that gets me over the criminal threshold. This is why it's just really important we see the report, we see it as much of it as we can, and sort of understand which end of that spectrum we're in, or whether we're in the middle, whether we're at the total exoneration end, or we're at the 84% end.
And so, based on the Barr letter, you're saying it doesn't meet the very tightly defined definition of criminal conspiracy, that the obstruction seems to be prepared for Congress to decide, not the Attorney General, and that the counterintelligence piece is been referred to the Gang of Eight in a way that we may not know what that's about for quite some time. What But this is all just from the Barr letter. So what do we know about the Mueller report? Do we even know actually how long it is?
So we know that it is greater than 300 pages in the core of the report and less than 400 pages, including appendices and tables.
What else do we know about it?
Well, so this is where I think we get into a part of the challenge of sort of looking at the totality of the Mueller investigation, which is there are a couple of universal truths that I would argue both Democrats and Republicans should be able to agree upon at this point. And again, I'm defining some of these bars remarkably low, but I think that they are important that we sort of all acknowledge in turn. One, it's great that Mueller was able to conclude his investigation on his own terms. That was not a foregone conclusion through this. We know from the Barr report on the Mueller report that one of the things he, as part of the regulations dealing with the special counsel, he was required to report whether there were any substantial disagreements between the Attorney General and the special counsel's office, and he said, effect, no. Bob Mueller was able to do everything that Bob Mueller thought was crucial to his investigation. Under the rule of law, that's a victory. It's not necessarily one we should be particularly proud of as a society, but given how the last 2.5 years transpired, I think that's important. Second is that Mueller established really that there were two criminal conspiracies that aided the election of Donald Trump. One run by the Russian government, according to the Barr report, independent of the Trump campaign, but a criminal conspiracy nonetheless by the Russian government to interfere with our election and aid the election of Donald Trump at the expense of Hillary Clinton. And second, a criminal conspiracy in which the president himself participated, individual number one, to pay these hush money payments to Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal in the final weeks of the election. That's two more criminal conspiracies than you normally have aiding the election of a president of the United States. Separate from that, Mueller has established that the Trump campaign was the largest collection of criminals that we have ever seen involved in a presidential campaign in American history. And sort of one of the things that is, I think we have sort of lost sight of because we sort of look back and skip over all of the things that Mueller did along the way, and we're like, oh, well, there were no indictments on collusion at the end of this, so Trump gets the clean bill of health. There was a stunning amount of totally unrelated criminality going on in the midst of the Trump campaign. Paul Manafort and Rick Gates were involved in a decade-long $65 million money laundering scheme involving bank fraud, tax fraud, and money laundering while they were working on the campaign. Michael Flynn, the national security advisor, was involved in a totally separate scheme working as an unregistered foreign agent of the government of Turkey in the midst of Donald Trump's campaign. Michael Cohen, the president's lawyer, was running his own totally separate tax and bank fraud scheme related to taxi medallions in the midst of the Trump campaign. And you can sort of imagine, and I did at sort of one point about a month ago, sort of play out the the equivalent of this, and sort of try to do the counterfactual of, what would the Republican reaction be to a special counsel investigating President Hillary Clinton, who had charged or gotten guilty pleas from John Podesta, the campaign chairman, Cheryl Mills, the deputy campaign chairman, Jake Sullivan, the Hillary Clinton's national security advisor, and Huma Abedin, the president's Clinton's sort of a rough equivalent of a Michael Cohen. I sort of feel like Mitch McConnell would have found time to hold one congressional hearing about that level of criminality in the midst of Hillary Clinton's campaign.
Is that a troubling precedent?
So I think it is. I think it is a very troubling precedent, and one that we don't want to be in a situation where that amount of criminality is a normalized and excused part of our political process. And the fact that, when you sort of look back over the last year, the greatest day of Donald Trump's presidency was last sort of Sunday into Monday, when he was totally exonerated of being an active agent of Russian intelligence. Despite this level of criminality, I would argue is setting the bar for the President of the United States rather low.
Let's talk about this that time period for a few minutes. What does Mueller have a relationship with Barr? Do they have a history?
So Barr and Mueller are they worked together in the Bush 41 administration. Barr was on his first stint then as Attorney General. Mueller was the head of the criminal division, the Assistant Attorney General for the criminal division. They actually worked pretty closely on two big projects, in addition to all of the day-to-day work: the Los Angeles riots and the bombing of Pan Am 103, which were both sort of Mueller's big efforts as AAG for criminal under Barr. They remain quite friendly. Their wives are close friends and in a Bible study group together. And Mueller has, according to Barr, I have not independently verified this other than Barr's reporting on it. Seeing a pattern here, there's a lot of sort of Barr reporting on Mueller here. Mueller actually went to the wedding of two of Barr's children, sort of as part of that friendship over the last 25 years.
So it does seem to me to be a bit of a stroke of genius to release this Barr letter and let that drive the media discussion and the public discussion around the Mueller report. And I wondered how you see that, and I also feel like the mainstream media has done us a bit of a disservice here in how they've covered this.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think you have to take sort of a couple of things as a starting point on the Barr report on the Mueller report. One is, I think we have to presume good faith on Bill Barr's part, that his summary, which he's already started to walk back whether it was actually a summary, in his third letter, which contradicted that the second letter was actually a summary. But I think we have to assume that Barr was close enough to the actual underlying top-line conclusions of Mueller's report, and that Barr might have legitimate points of departure in terms of his interpretation of that report or his role.
Barr's a serious guy.
He's a serious guy.
His role in history.
And I do believe that if it was fundamentally wrong, if Mueller had, for instance, recommended the indictment of the president, or that there were dozens of sealed indictments of every member of the president's family just waiting for January 21, 2025, I think we would have heard that by now. I think we sort of have to assume that the Barr letter is close enough. That said, I do remain puzzled by this question of whether Barr actually was intended by Mueller to be the ultimate decider on the question of obstruction, or whether Mueller and whether sort of Barr ingenuously or disingenuously inserted himself into that process in a way that Mueller did not intend.
I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience here. I am going to give students priority, but are there questions? Or while you think of your questions, I have another question for Garrett. It strikes me that the Starr report was really handled very differently.
Yes. So the Starr report was handled differently for a couple of reasons, by statute and by precedent. And I think it's important to understand that. Remember, Ken Starr was an independent counsel, not a special counsel. So he had a different reporting structure and a different set of authorities than Robert Mueller did. And that Mueller in many ways was actually constrained by Ken Starr, because Ken Starr was such an agreed upon bipartisan disaster that they rewrote the regulations so that it's now a special counsel, not an independent counsel. So Mueller has to go through the Department of Justice in a way that Ken Starr did not. Second is around that question of investigation, where and I have sort of said this before, the president is very lucky that he was not investigated by the Democratic equivalent of Ken Starr. Mueller went in with one question, appears to have defined that question narrowly, and answered that one question. Ken Starr went in to investigate a decades-old failed real estate transaction and ended up sort of indicting or impeaching for an affair that had not even transpired at the time that Ken Starr started his original investigation, that he sort of stuck around until there were enough crimes that he had uncovered to get the report that he wanted. And then the third thing that is different is there was sort of actually what we're seeing right now with this series of redactions and sort of review by Bill Barr is also a reaction to the Ken Starr debacle, where there was sort of this political hot potato that this report was coming, and sort of both sides on Capitol Hill said, well, we don't want the responsibility for redacting this and figuring out what is to be made public, so we're just going to agree to release it sight unseen. And that's how the Starr report basically went directly from Ken Starr to the front page of the Drudge Report to be downloaded by whatever the early equivalent of the PDF was at that time.
Still the PDF.
Still the PDF.
What about, I want to go back to the counterintelligence piece. What happens? The Gang of Eight has this, and you suggested in that's like that makes it a very serious. There must be some very serious stuff in there, and so how might that
ongoing stuff? That to me is what the. And again, I might be wrong, I might be overreading these tea leaves, but in general, sort of a good way of dividing what the House, what goes to the full House Intelligence Committee versus the Gang of Eight is ongoing activity.
And so does that mean that that investigation is going to continue in some other part of the FBI? Is that what that means?
Yeah, and presumably has been. And one of the things that is important to understand about counterintelligence is counterintelligence operates with a different end goal in mind. In a counterintelligence operation, your goal is not a criminal indictment. Your goal is disruption. And so that could mean simply being aware of the activity so that you're able to isolate or redirect the activity. It could mean just making the activity public. Sort of one of the biggest things that we can argue at great length whether the Obama administration should have done more. But one of the things that the Obama administration did when confronted with the unprecedented attack unfolding in 2016 was simply talk about it publicly, because they've sort of the public awareness of that ongoing attack and the possibility of an ongoing attack by Russia was a way to counter that intelligence operation.
All right, questions? We'll start back here. Yeah.
Hi, Scott Hefner, Advanced Leadership Fellow. Thank you. Great discussion. I think I read that that Mueller let Barr know several weeks ahead that he wasn't going to be bringing obstruction charges. So, did you hear that? Is that true?
Yes.
So why, and what was the impact of that?
Well, so this is, again, where we just need to see how Mueller has framed this himself in his own words in his own report. So, again, one of the reasons to sort of believe good faith on the part of Bill Barr is that he says in his letter that it was not just him making this decision on obstruction, it's Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein. Rod Rosenstein has been involved in every single day of the Russia investigation. This is the thing that more than anything has defined his entire time as the Deputy Attorney General, was the fact that he was the acting Attorney General in regards to the Russia probe. So Rod Rosenstein has presumably had remarkable insight and consistent insight about how Mueller's investigation was proceeding. And so if Rosenstein is signing on to this set of conclusions, that's one of the things that sort of leads me to think, all right, like this is probably within the standard deviation of what Mueller actually found, because Rod would have had a good understanding. And that, by the way, is one of the things that I'm not that concerned by the fact that sort of Barr turned around his top line conclusions in 48 hours off of a 400-page report. Because presumably they've sort of understood this. Barr presumably got a big briefing when he came in as Attorney General and assumed control of the investigation. But I do think that, understanding what Mueller really said when he said, I'm not going to bring an obstruction charge. Because, by the way, he says in his own words in the Barr report that it's not that he exonerated the president, which is different than that which he says he found about the conspiracy question, which is, there is sort of no equivalent line in the conspiracy thing that says, I didn't exonerate the president on conspiracy.
Right here, yeah.
Nils Enevoldsen, I'm a research fellow here. In the coming weeks and months, what are we looking forward to seeing that is not necessarily going to be front page news? What are you interested in that we might not know to look for?
Well, I think the thing that I'm looking for in the next couple of weeks is the thing everyone is looking for that will be presumably front page news, which is when we actually see the Mueller report. And Barr has set up this test in his third letter about receiving this report. he sets up sort of these 4 categories of things that he is presumably working through as part of his review for redactions. One is what's called 6E testimony, which is basically grand jury testimony, that it is a federal felony to release without the court's permission. So that is a very clear thing that you would want to work through. Second is classified sources and methods. Third is anything that would compromise an ongoing investigation. And we know that Mueller has sort of spun out all of these investigations. We don't know what they are. We don't know who the targets are. But we know that he has spun out a lot of investigations. And the fourth are things that would unduly, interesting word, infringe on the privacy of third parties. So that presumably could be the president's children, which is where you get into some interesting questions about that unduly word. But those 4 categories that Barr has thrown up, I'm dubious of them for the following reason. Mueller knew all 4 of those sets of objections, every word that he wrote of this report. It's not that 10 days ago he turns in this 400-page report, Bill Barr is sitting there flipping through it and is like, Bob, you used a bunch of grand jury testimony. And Bob's like, oh man, I can't believe I've used all that grand jury stuff. I guess no one's ever going to see this report publicly. He obviously knew that that was going to be an objection. One of the things that you can do very clearly is go to the court and get permission to release that, which is precisely what happened with the grand juries in Whitewater and the grand juries in Watergate. So that's easily addressable, presuming that Mueller thought about that going through, which I think it is literally laughable that any of these objections did not occur to Mueller in the course of writing the report. Second, the classified sources and methods. Again, there's a process within government where you go through intelligence information, make it part of a publicly releasable criminal document, measure the equities of various intelligence agencies like the National Security Agency, and turn that into something that is publicly releasable, which, by the way, Mueller has already done in the IRA and the GRU indictments. If you go back to those 2 indictments last year, the IRA, Internet Research Agency indictment in February, and the GRU indictment in July last year, those are actually 2 of the most insightful public documents we have ever seen about the NSA's signals intelligence collection capabilities and what our intelligence agencies are able to go out and do that we have ever seen publicly released. I mean, the fact that we learned as much as we did about the NSA's sources and methods in terms of, that we know who individual Internet Research Agency employees were filing their expenses to inside the organization, that we know what those IRA employees were writing to their family members on specific days at specific moments. It tells us an incredible amount about our, what's called the SIGINT capabilities of the NSA. So again, that's a whole category of stuff where Mueller has proven his ability to work through those equities to make that information public, and presumably wrote this whole report. It's the same people writing all of this stuff. It's not like there was a totally separate team, working on the Mueller report who had no knowledge of what the Mueller prosecutors were doing. So this is a sort of set of potential objections that I think it is highly unlikely that Mueller didn't carefully consider in drafting this 400-page report.
Andy Summer, I'm an ALI fellow. The delivery of the Mueller report has spawned little cottage industry of media coverage of the Mueller investigation, and I'm thinking specifically of the Matt Taibbi piece in
Yep.
response to that. Do you think that soul searching is warranted?
Well, we're here at the Shorenstein Center on the press and public policy, or whatever your actual name is. So let me comment on the media coverage of the media coverage of the Mueller investigation. And I actually, I'm biased. I have spent the last 2.5 years of my life reporting on this and covering it pretty closely, and hope that is a chapter of my life that is drawing to a close. I'm optimistic that I will not be here a year from now continuing to talk about the Mueller investigation yet again.
You never know.
I actually think that we have seen stunningly good journalism come out of this investigation. And what I mean by that is we have actually known most of the big revelations that Mueller has brought because of incredibly good investigative journalism that has taken place over these last 2 or 3 years. In some ways, the investigative journalism has been ahead of where Mueller's investigators were. Mueller's team only learned about the June 2016 Trump Tower meeting from the New York Times article reporting on the existence of the June 2016 Trump Tower meeting. And I think that, part of the problem of the Matt Taibbi argument is it cherry picks sort of particular examples as a broad brush way to sort of say all of the coverage of the Mueller investigation was garbage. And I just don't believe that that's actually true. And I believe that you can sort of pick out individual pundits who are not investigative journalists who sort of got far out over their skis. I don't think we have seen anything that calls into question the legitimacy of the underlying sets of questions that the investigative journalism and commentary have raised about this. There were 106 contacts between 16 Trump campaign officials and people linked to Russia during the 2016 campaign, the transition in the early days of the White House. I've covered Washington for a dozen years. That is a lot of contact with a lot of Russians. This is not a government like the UK or even Israel, by the way, that you just run into a lot in Washington, where you sort of have a lot of routine contacts. You have foreign Kremlin-linked officials, Natalia Veselnitskaya, coming to Trump Tower saying, we're from the Russian government and we'd like to help. And you have the president's son replying in capital letters, "I love it," in an email that he releases himself. Those are totally legitimate questions for investigation, for follow-up, for incredibly good investigative work by all manner of journalists. And I just don't see, I don't see at the end of the day the idea that the President of the United States is not an active asset of Russian intelligence being either a letdown or a failure. I think that's actually a really good thing for our country, that at the end of this, sort of Mueller has said, well, I can't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the president is actively an asset of Russian intelligence. And that, but we're sort of wrestling with this as if that was the only acceptable conclusion, and if he didn't show that, then everything else was illegitimate. Again, I think we should set a basic bar where the expectation is not that the President of the United States is an active asset of the intelligence services of our leading traditional adversary. And that if that is ever a remote question, we should investigate that and try to come to a determination of whether that's true. And if we prove that that's not true, that shouldn't be a great day for your presidency.
Last question, Bill.
Bill Thornton, Shorenstein Advisory. Do you think Mueller is going to testify in Congress? And if he does, what constraints do you think he'll be under?
I guess I would be ultimately surprised if Mueller doesn't testify, simply because I sort of don't see. I think this just has to end with that in some ways, that there'll be sort of always this unanswered set of questions until Mueller is actually there standing under oath and someone asks him, did Rod Rosenstein ever tell you not to indict the president? The question of what he will say, of course, is a difficult one, in part because it hinges on the question of whether he's still employed by the Department of Justice at the time that he's testifying, or whether he's a private citizen, at which point basically he can say anything that he wants, which is how we've seen Jim Comey and Andy McCabe and others go up and testify as private citizens. But at the end of the day, I have spent more time interviewing Bob Mueller than I believe all other reporters in the United States combined. And if you were waiting for Mueller unplugged at the end of this to sort of let loose and speak his mind in a way that he did not do in whatever this 300 to 400 page document is that he and a team of 60 people have spent 2.5 years writing, I think you will find yourself again disappointed by the end of the Mueller investigation.
Do you think he will discuss the report itself?
I do think he will. That's my guess, is that we'll see the report come out, some version of it, and then we will see the him go up and sort of close out. Obviously it looks like Bill Barr might testify May 1st, May 2nd, but I would be surprised ultimately if we don't see Mueller. But again, and this may go back a little bit to the question of the terrible journalism around this. I have been surprised by most of what has transpired over the last 2.5 years. Because for the first 6 months that I talked about this, from October 2016 and through the spring of 2017, the literal example that I would use is like, look, it's not like there's going to be an email from the Russians saying, we're the Russians and we'd like to help, that they send to Donald Trump. And then it turns out actually that email literally exists. So I think the general challenge in this entire case has been that the realm of the possible is wider than we can possibly imagine.
On that disturbing note, I want to thank Garrett for this incredible time. I'm going to encourage all of you to buy his books, The Threat Matrix, Raven Rock, and his new forthcoming book, The Only Plane in the Sky. And I guess we'll look forward to another book about Bob Mueller.
I would imagine that there is another book about Bob Mueller in my future.
I hope to see you all next Tuesday with Jill Abrams.